Hola, buenas tardes, todes, todas, todos. Welcome, everyone. My name is Yomaira Figueroa-Vásquez, and I'm so honored to be here with my colleague and brilliant thinker, Dr. Marisel Moreno. Do you mind if I do an introduction of you before we get started?
No, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So Professor Marisel Moreno is the Reverend John A. O'Brien College Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures at the University of Notre Dame, where she teaches U.S. Latina, Latine, Latino, and Latinx literature. She is the author of the incredible book, Family Matters, Puerto Rican Women Authors on the Island and the Mainland, which was published in 2012 by University of Virginia Press, and of this incredible book, Crossing Waters, Undocumented Migration in Hispanophone Caribbean and Latinx Literature and Art, which was published in July 2022 by the University of Texas Press, and it's actually part of the Latinx The Future Is Now series. This book won the 2023 Caribbean Studies Association Gordon K. and Sybil Lewis Book Award, and also received an Isis Duarte Book Prize honorable mention from the Latin American Studies Association's Haiti Dominican Studies section. She is the recipient of the Indiana Governor's Award for Service Learning, the Sheedy Excellence in Teaching Award, the Reverend William A. Toohey Award for Social Justice. And she also teaches and researches in areas including Afro-Latinx and Afro-Caribbean literature and cultural productions. She has numerous articles published in various of top journals in the field and has co-created and co-organized with Thomas Anderson the Digital Humanities Project, Listening to Puerto Rico, which is incredible. If you haven't visited it, please do. I'll make sure that I link it in the chat. She's also co-curated with Anderson the exhibit Art at the Service of the People, Posters and Books from Puerto Rico's Division of Community Education, DIVEDCO, for the Snipe Museum at Notre Dame. The exhibit has traveled to California Lutheran University, the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture, and was on digital display at the Galería de Arte at Universidad Sagrado Corazón in Puerto Rico. There was a website created for that, and I'll make sure that I link that as well. She's also organized the amazing conference that I had the honor to participate in, the Centering Blackness, Challenging Latinidades, Latinx Studies Association Conference hosted by ILS on campus in July 2022, as well as participated in the Afro-Latino Poetics Conference that was also really incredible. That was also in the fall of 2022. Today, we're going to be talking about this new book, the newest book, the Crossing Waters text. And I would love to invite Professor Marisel Moreno to talk to us a little bit more about the journey to the creation of this book and how that has fit into the larger arc of your work.
Thank you. And first of all, I want to say I'm very, very honored to be here, to have been invited by Centro to talk a little bit about my book, which seems like ages ago that it came out. Doesn't feel new anymore, but I guess it certainly is the most recent. So thank you for that very, very generous introduction too. So to tell you a little bit about the journey to the book, there's different aspects, right? Working at once. Growing up in Puerto Rico, I often, as a child, was exposed to a lot of the headlines and newspaper articles regarding people traveling in Yola from the Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico, or Haitians to many of them capsizing, dying, in the process. And that was something that, as a child, I just remember that it really, impacted me. I was really bothered by all of that. And because I was seeing at the same time, I was observing. And obviously, as I grew up, this became even more evident that there was so much anti-Dominican and anti-Haitian sentiment and anti-Black sentiment in Puerto Rico, right? The racism there. So trying to put all that together, but then, that's the personal side. So it stuck with me, right? And this was a topic that I was interested in, throughout my life. But on the academic side, having going through my grad studies and which centered on, on Latinx literature, seeing so much written about the Mexico-US border, right? The theories of, Gloria del Saldúa are foundational to Latino studies as a field, and those of others too. So I saw this constant, presence of the Mexico-US border, but at the same time, I was very much aware that there were a lot of people trying to cross in the Caribbean, from one island to the other, and then just not seeing that reflected in the scholarship. Not completely, but I just didn't think there was enough on this material. So I was also interested in looking at what literature actually dealt with that topic, right? And in the case of so I started with Puerto Rican literature, looking at, where is the Dominican migrant presence, and say for a few works, texts, that had been published, there was not much either. So a big moment for me was when Mayra Santos Febres's Boat People, the collection Boat People came out, because that was the first time that I felt that in Puerto Rican literatures, we were seeing a shift, even though the topic had been treated, by Magali Garcia Ramis or even Ana Lidia Vega, that had been done more in jest, and there were some issues with those works this was a completely new thing. So Both People by Mayra Santos Febres really, really inspired me to look into that poetry, and I ended up writing an article about it that became really the seed for the book eventually, many years later, because I was still working on my first book, right? So these things are overlapping as they're happening. But yeah, it really inspired me because I saw that for the first time, Dominicans and Haitians and other people migrating within the Caribbean, especially trying to make it to Puerto Rico, were being portrayed in a way that humanized them, right? In a way that this literature, this poetry was looking to make us reflect as Puerto Ricans on the presence of these brothers and sisters on the island, right? On our archipelago, I mean. So that's a little bit about the background of it. I mean, I could keep going, but I'll stop there. That's probably longer than you expected.
No. I love it because I think there's some really important gems there that you might not even know, because that you might not know that you've shared with us, which is the idea that the seed of a new project can be born, right? Or can be planted in the middle of something else. I think this is really important for younger scholars to kind of think about, because oftentimes you are so singularly focused on the one thing that you're doing that you could imagine, like you might have an idea and be like, no, go away idea, right? Go away preoccupation and concern, because tengo que terminar esto. So I think it's really beautiful that, like, you are inspired, and I can tell by reading the book that you are inspired by the kind of literary poetics as well as by visual art, right? In the way that you are trying to bring forward these stories and illuminate these lived experiences that are being reflected in the literature. Yeah.
Right. No, I think you're right. I think you're right. At the moment, I remember just working on my first book, but having this itch, like I really have to write an article, a little article. I was trying to convince myself on this poetry collection. It's just not gonna let me be in peace if I don't try to put it out there, write it first and then try to publish it.
Yeah.
So I was doing all that at the same time. So it is true. It is something that we often don't keep in mind. We think that we can just or we should just focus on one thing at a time. And I think being open to other ideas that are coming through as you're working on a particular project is really important too, because you never know where that's going to lead you to, right? Absolutely. And that's exactly what happened to me. This article that I thought I was done with kept living in my brain for so many years, and then inspired me to continue looking for even more literature. So I started with literature, but then I my baby steps, in terms of the visual arts started happening with the work I did for, you mentioned the DIVETCO, the División de Educación para la Comunidad, in Puerto Rico, the work I did for that, helping write the catalog, translate, etc. All of that inspired me to become, even though I was never trained as, an art critic, right? More like a literary critic. I started developing more of a sense of, perhaps comfort, like maybe I can do it. So it was a huge step, because my first book it had no images. Like my first book has no images at all,
I have
right?
it here on my shelf. It's a
It's
beautiful book,
just literature. It's just
Yeah.
about literature, and there's not a single image.
Yeah.
And then for this one, I was like, am I going to do this or not? I feel like, I had come across several works of art. I had met some of the artists along the way. And I was like, even though I have not been trained in, as an art critic, I think we need to bring those into the conversation. I wanted to produce an interdisciplinary book too. So looking at different types of literature, different types of art, and all of that. So anyway, so yeah, that's a little bit about how it all came together. But of course, it took many, many, many years.
Right. As many things do, right, in this kind of
Yeah.
work, to do so in a way that is careful, that is ethical, that is really trying to get a sense of the historical, social, right, and political ramifications. And this book is extremely political, right? It is one that is looking at what you're calling undocumented and unauthorized migration. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to use those terms? You use them interchangeably throughout the book, right? Unauthorized and undocumented. ¿Por qué?
Right. I think that first of all, because that is the type of experience that I was interested in examining how it comes through in literature. I do not believe in using the terminology that we hear very colloquially of illegal immigrant. So I use the term undocumented, unauthorized. I could have used irregular too. I didn't at the time, to signal and to refer to the type of migration that I see happening, or that many of us know is happening in the Caribbean, among the different territories or the islands of the Caribbean. So I begin with Puerto Rico because for obvious reasons, because it is a colony of the United States. It has functioned as a stepping stone to the United States for many people, especially Dominicans, right? But so I guess I'm deviating a little bit from your question, which was why using these terms, but those were the terms that I could think of, right? That sounded, or that in a way were not further dehumanizing the people that I am talking about, the communities that I am talking about. So that was the reason behind the choice. And it's very different. There's so much in Latinx literature. And again, I'm speaking from my position as someone who, I mean, that's my field, right? Latinx literature. There is so much written on migration, right? The migration experience. Oftentimes, most of the time, it centers on those experiences once people are in the US, right? In the continental US. Once they've made it, right? Whether you're talking about Cubans, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and of course, that needs to happen. That is a conversation that has been happening for a long time. Not that we don't need to do more studies. There's plenty that needs to be examined further, but there is this one thing about undocumented migration. You know, Marta Caminero Santangelo wrote her book on undocumented, the undocumented in Latinx literature too. And she made a comment, right, in her introduction, I believe, where she said, despite the fact that this is such a central experience among many Latinos and Latinas, right, it's not talked about enough. It doesn't show up enough in literature, in the creative production, right, in the cultural production of Latinos and Latinas, right? So, and it's true. It's true. It's not like I found so many possibilities of works of literature or visual art that I could examine for this particular book. But I wanted to center on this experience because I began talking about the Mexico-US border, but one of the great aims that I have for the book is to, at least momentarily, try to shift the attention slightly to the Caribbean for many reasons. One of them is that hundreds of thousands of people have been interdicted by the US Coast Guard trying to cross, between those islands and to Puerto Rico, or trying to cross to the Florida Keys. Hundreds of thousands in the last 30 years. Those are the ones that have been interdicted. That doesn't count those who have tried and had to turn back, or those who actually made it without being caught, or the ones who perished along the way, which is in the thousands. And we will never know exactly. The remains are lying at the bottom of the seafloor, right? So I noticed that a lot of the art that I engaged with insisted on the possibility of death. Even Mayra Santos Febres' collection, in a way, is a warning, right? Because it's very hard to make it. And even if you make it to Puerto Rico, like Tiburon de Onyx says, ñam at the end, right? It's gonna swallow you. It's not easy, right?
Mm.
And there's so much misunderstanding. There's so much, we have to obviously keep in mind. I mean, this may be obvious to some people and not others, but part of what I wanted to do also in trying to bring attention to what's happening in the Caribbean is the fact that the majority of undocumented migrants in the Caribbean tend to be Afro-descendant, Black or Afro-descendant.
Mm-hmm.
And that Blackness tends to be erased, even though it exists along the Mexico-US border, especially if we're thinking now of the number of Haitians and Venezuelans making it there. But historically, it's been pretty invisibilized, right? But in the case of the Caribbean, you cannot deny it, right? And it is not coincidence that these are the people being mostly affected and pushed by, because this is not something that people take lightly, that they say, oh, I just feel like jumping in a yola today and I'm just going to try to make it in Puerto Rico. It sounds much better over there. Right. These are decisions not taken lightly, and people know the risk. People know that there's a high percentage of not making it, dying along the way for so many reasons, right? So yeah, it's just this combination of factors. Like it hopefully it's gonna help people, especially through the historical backgrounds that I provide in the first chapter, like the why of Dominican migration to Puerto Rico, the why of Haitian migration to the Dominican Republic, the why of Cuban migration to Puerto Rico, or to the Florida Keys, right? So to try to promote empathy, because I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle that we're missing in this day and age, like the understanding of why people are coming, to Puerto Rico, to the US, wherever. We can speak about it globally at the end, right? So
yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great answer, because I'm thinking about the kind of ethical implication of using these terms like undocumented and unauthorized, and not the kinds of terms that are really dehumanizing, such as illegal or alien or et cetera,
Right.
right? This becomes really important in particular because so much of the discourse in Latino studies and even the discourse in the US as a whole when it comes to migration is so hyper-focused on the US-Mexico border,
Yeah.
and now more recently on the kind of larger Central American migration through Mexico, right, to the border. And these very like politically inflammatory terms get thrown around and used at the same time that folks are sacrificing every single part of their lives and their livelihoods to try to make it somewhere where maybe they can have a livable life, right?
Right.
And I think that you've captured so aptly the context of like what the contribution is to thinking about migration to Puerto Rico as this kind of odd, annexed Commonwealth, nebulous colony of the United States, and
Mm-hmm.
what migration to this set of islands does, right?
Yeah.
In the larger imagination for thinking about Puerto Rico as a space of constant migration, not just Puerto Rican migration to the United States, as has often been,
Mm-hmm.
noted, and we know deeply because of our studies in Puerto Rican studies, but
Right.
also other folks, our neighbors, right? In Puerto Rico, migrating to us, and also Puerto Ricans migrating to other islands, right? So
Yeah.
all of this becomes this really complex networks, but and in your book, I really appreciate that it's not just a kind of like exploration of these like networks of connection, migration, and sacrifice as like a novel thought, but actually really centering the racialized experience of people. These are Black people, right?
Yeah.
These are Afro-descendant people. These are people who are descendants of enslaved, right? And or libertos, right? Who are trying to live, right, in a deeply anti-Black world,
Yeah.
and that find their way to migrate to Puerto Rico. And if they make it, right, like there's something about that journey. So first of all, I love
Yeah.
the sustained attention that you have to the journey, to
Yeah.
the imagination, and to the connection of the journey.
Yeah.
And then on the other end, what we do know about this in Puerto Rico is that many of these migrants come in as a racialized underclass in Puerto Rico, right?
Right.
So then this is the kind of thing that the wave cuts both ways, right?
Mhm.
And I think that is perhaps one of the most beautiful parts about the book is your deep attention to these kinds of nuances in the story, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I love that image of the wave cutting both ways. It's perfect. No, you're right. And like you said, I am very, very intentionally focusing on the trajectory, right? That moment of in-betweenness at sea. As much as I could look at materials that spoke about that experience, I was really drawn to that because again, there's a lot of works that have been produced, cultural works, right, that dealt with the before or the after, but usually not the in between when it comes to undocumented intra-Caribbean migration, right? So that's part of it, and then you mentioned my intentional focus on Black and Afro-descendant people, again, because they are the majority of the people who are engaging in this type of movement, right? And if they make it, to wherever they're going, they end up facing a lot of racism and discrimination, which in fact they also face in their countries of origin, right? That's why they end up being expulsados, right? Like pushed out. So I was really interested in the work that some of these paintings, even the poetry was doing in terms of evoking the Middle Passage. And for two reasons. Number one, evoking the Middle Passage as they are dealing primarily with modern undocumented migration, right? So I noticed that in several of the works, and I'm like, obviously this is not coincidental, and the way that I try to explain it, and of course, I'm happy to discuss this because there's a million ways probably to understand it, but it's not like this is the definitive way. But in a way, to me, in my mind, it helped in two ways. Number one, it helped with thinking of Puerto Rico and the deep racism that exists there, the anti-Blackness, right? Thinking of, when you have Mayra Santos Febres, right, who has written so much about negritude in Puerto Rico, right? But speaking in her poems, right, from both people about how there are connections between modern day undocumented immigrants and their ancestors who were brought, right, kidnapped, shipped, against their will and enslaved in the Caribbean. It's a way to speak back to those in Puerto Rico and in the Dominican Republic and in Cuba who continue to deny the importance of Black ancestors, right? Of Blackness, period, in the region to this day, as the majority of the population of those islands and as the people who really built those nations in the end, right? So it's going against that Hispanismo, the whole idea of, speaking back to the mejorar la raza, side of things, and Latinidad as really whitewashed, etc. But on the other hand, there's been an exclusion of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean in discussions of the Middle Passage, like, if you think of the Black Atlantic, there's not much discussion of the connection to the formerly Spanish colonized, territories, right? So in a way, it's also speaking back to what Lorgia Garcia Peña calls, I call it something different. She came up with hegemonic Blackness, which I think is perfect. And if her book had come out first, I would have used that term because I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I was looking for, right? I think I call it Anglo-centered Blackness, right? So it's speaking to that erasure of the Hispanophone Caribbean within those larger discussions. Traditionally, I know there's a lot of work being done right now, and you're involved with a lot of that work too, of course. But I just mean traditionally, right? And certainly pretty invisibilized back in the, couple decades ago. So I saw these works doing this like double function at the same time in terms of Blackness, but again, all in with the goal of demonstrating how literature and art are trying to humanize undocumented migrants. Something that, I think we need to, society at large can probably benefit from staring a little longer at one of these works, right? And thinking of what it means and what's our position, what's our role in those structures of oppression, against others.
Absolutely. I think your work makes some really interesting interventions and really necessary interventions, particularly when it comes to thinking about the Hispanophone Caribbean, right? Because oftentimes we do think of these insular territories as also insular with one another because of the kind of facility of language, right?
Yeah.
With one another, and oftentimes dissected from the larger histories of the Antilles and also from the larger histories of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And what we have always known is that that these experiences, the descendants of folks who were dispossessed and enslaved, are as human as those who attempt to humanize them. And oftentimes our work can serve in the service of highlighting some of the aspects of how these incredible histories of resilience, of joy, right? And of
Yeah.
sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
What those things do, and actually how they add these really critical facets to the human experience, right?
Yeah.
But that often are underserved, often ignored and erased, right?
Yeah.
And I think you are able to show that, as well as show a relationality, right? Because there's something also about the kind of archipelagic thinking in the work. So there's kind of two things I wanted to bring up.
Yeah.
Part of it is the kind of question as the sea as a third space. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit more about the visual art in the book. But maybe, you know, I would like to kind of just share, for those of you listening, something that Marisel writes at the very beginning. And I love that you brought this in at the top of the book by saying, you say on page 4, by focusing on the process of maritime border crossings, what happens in that in-between space that separates the islands of the archipelago, I reveal how the sea functions as a third space or a contact zone that connects islands, right? It reminds me so much of the work that was done for many decades now in Oceania, right? In Pacific Island studies, around thinking about the sea, particularly the work of Apeli Haufa's Our Sea of Islands, when he talks about the kind of colonial understanding of the Pacific Islands as like many islands in a sea, rather than as a sea of islands, right? So that a perspective of how do we see ourselves in relation to the sea, in relation to our, you know, kin in other island formations. And so that moment where you're shifting is also kind of pointing to an archipelagic turn in Puerto Rican studies, an archipelagic turn in the kind of broader Caribbean studies. And so I was wondering if you wanted to talk to us a little bit more about that sea as a third space, the kind of conceptualization of these waters as also part of the territory of our people.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that comment. So I would say the first thing that emerges, and I know I mentioned this earlier, is the fact that throughout history, beginning with the transatlantic slave trade, the bottom of the sea, all into the Caribbean, has been marked by the presence of the remains of those who died in many different ways, right? Either because they committed suicide, they decided to, you know, that they could not handle the horrific conditions of those journeys, you know, or because they died or were thrown, et cetera, to modern day migrants who also die along the way. Sometimes they suffer from hallucinations because, you know, being exposed to the sun or lack of water, lack of food, and they themselves think they have arrived and they throw themselves overboard. I have also heard interviews with people who have come in yolas, right? And they talk about how menstruating girls and women are immediately thrown overboard so as not to attract, you know, to save the group and not attract sharks to come and attack them. So the seafloor is full of all of these remains of people across the ages, Black people, Afro-descendant people who continue to remain there. So that is like it becomes a third space where they join together. In her collection, Mayra Santos Febres speaks beautifully about this space. You know, she has a poem, I think is the last one, En el fondo del mar danzan concejales, right? And it's this incredible representation of Black ancestors welcoming the newly drowned, right, to the bottom of the sea, where they have formed what she calls a city of the undocumented. So beautiful imagery to refer to this very, very tragic situation. So that's part of it. The other part of the importance of the sea, right? What I'm trying to do in the book is connecting in a way like merging border theory and archipelago theory. And the way that I trace that, it leads me in the first chapter, it leads me to speak about water as the one, the water dual function as border and bridge, like it could be either or, border or bridge, that becomes a central connection between border theory and archipelago theory. Now, interestingly, in archipelagos have tended to be imagined by colonial powers and by empires as isolated regions that are easily conquerable, right, and controlled. In the case of the Caribbean, we know because of its history that it was colonized. Obviously, the indigenous populations were there for thousands of years before the arrival of the Europeans. And we have so the Caribbean itself was like split apart because part of it was colonized by the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the English, et cetera, right? So it became really fragmented. And that comes through today. When I grew up in Puerto Rico, to be honest, they really didn't teach me anything about our neighbor islands. What I learned, I had to learn later on my own. So they continue to keep the islands of the Caribbean, the people, disjointed, right? Not paying attention to what's happening, in our neighbor islands of this archipelago that we share. So through literature, I think this is a way to reconnect, seeing what are some of the connections through the art, what emerges there that connects us as a people. But that is also, it's part of pushing against that imposed segregation that functions very well for the goals of US empire. Because in the end, right now, as we speak, is the US that controls and has militarized the region. So anyway, I could go on and on about this, but that's part of what's happening there with the sea as a third space that is, I find it to be crucial, in thinking about the archipelago and the movements of people. Because these movements, and I finish now, visibilize that we are an archipelago. It's like sometimes we forget we're an archipelago because we're just so worried, like, oh, we're Puerto Rico and these are our problems, or here's Cuba and these are their problems, and here's Dominican Republic and Haiti, all separated, right? But in a way, this is a way to kind of counteract that division, in our minds, and recognize how we are connected. And these movements of people reflect that. So.
Yeah. No, I love that. Thank you, Marisel, because I think it's so important. I think that third space also conjures for like a select reader, right? The kind of post-colonial theory, Homi Baba, third space.
Oh, yeah.
Todo eso. But I think it's so important. And I think there's something really un poquito cómico also about it, like not on purpose, but it's just like, it's so funny that we have this kind of post-colonial theory being really helpful in helping us conceive of this, and yet Puerto Rico has not reached yet a post-colonial status, right?
Right.
But yeah. I think that there is something really important about the kind of relationships between colonized and formerly colonized people in their vision of the world that allows us to kind of better articulate our own experiences, both that are similar and that are distinct, right?
Yeah.
In that context. Yeah. I want to use, like, you talked about like this militarized zone, right? These zones and these kind of way of thinking about borders. And there's one of the images in the book, the Tony Capellan image, that I think like as soon as you said that, like really it came to mind. So do we want to show that?
We can show it real quick. I'm not sure how we're doing on time here, but I'll share it. Let me scroll slideshow. Can you see it? Okay, I'm gonna. There it is.
There we go.
Yeah, yep. Mar Caribe. Yes, by Tony Capellan. This is, to me, one of I I talk about this piece in the first chapter, because to me, I feel like it really captures the essence of the book in a way. Tony Capellan used, he was he passed unfortunately, but he was an installation artist, a Dominican installation artist, and for this particular piece, and for many others actually, he would just collect quote unquote trash, right, from the shores, of riverbanks or the urban beaches of Santo Domingo. Like he would just go around collecting trash, right? And for this piece specifically, he decided to collect flip-flops, right? Different hues of green and blue, and from a distance, it even the texture of it, right, resembles like the waves and the colors of the Caribbean Sea. But then upon closer examination, you see that the straps are made out of barbed wire. So in the end, so of course, each flip-flop representing a particular person, right, and a particular history. But the fact that the straps are made out of barbed wire, of course, I analyze it, in a lot of detail quite a bit of detail in the book, but basically it's a reminder of the Caribbean Sea as a border, right? Which is exactly where I start. It's like we need to be thinking of the importance of the Caribbean archipelago, the entire region, as also very important when it comes to border studies. So yeah, this is one of the pieces that I find most interesting. I mean, but again, it is hard to choose because so many of them I think are fabulous. But
Well,
I don't think we have much time to show any others right now. But people, yeah, if you look through the book, you'll be able to see.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that comes to mind when looking at the kind of up close image are the different sizes of
Yeah,
chancletas,
yeah.
to see the larger and then like little children's like chancletas, right? It's something that is really brings home the radical and radicalizing nature, right, of coming to grips with the kind of human cost
Right.
of this kind of migration, right? And the barbed wires also show, right? They add another layer, right?
Yeah.
To thinking about empire, to thinking about access, right?
Yes.
And possibility,
Yeah.
and the ways that folks traverse this.
Yeah.
We do have a few minutes left. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat quite yet, but please feel free to put questions in the chat for Marisel. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit to us while we wait for questions to kind of think about the ways that you're thinking about marronage and escape, because that's also something that is coming through the book itself.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, and I think really beautifully, it's like it's a sneaky little thing, right? Like as marronage also is, right? It's like furtive,
Yeah.
and really powerful way of absconding and rebelling. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about how that appears and perhaps some of the texts that it appears in that have helped you to think through that concept and that action?
No, that's funny you say that, because I do quote you when I talk about marronage. That and actually looking back, I just wish I had expanded on that idea, because I do mention it. I draw links, between more historical marronage and then what is happening with undocumented people who, if they make it, let's say, in the case of a Haitian or a Dominican person in Puerto Rico, they have escaped, first of all, their own country, right? Where the situation is so dire. And, I look at different moments. Sometimes it's due to hunger, sometimes it's due to political persecution, right? So there's a whole set of reasons why people embark on these very, very dangerous journeys. But if they are escaping, that very oppressive order in their countries of origin, thinking that they will in search for survival. That's the bottom line, right? That's why people do it, to try to survive. And I think everyone can probably, as a human being, we can all relate to that. If you were drawn to push to the edge, what would you do to try to survive, right? But then once let's say they make it to Puerto Rico, then they still need to continue surviving on a daily basis, not just in relation to all of the anti-Blackness, prejudice, the xenophobia that exists in Puerto Rican society. Same thing when you're talking about Haitians in the Dominican Republic that I also get into. So it's this constant act of trying to survive, and under the radar, right? They need to hide, literally, if they are undocumented. People constantly live in the fear of being captured and deported, their families breaking up. So it really lends itself to this connecting, having these parallels with historical examples of marronage, but at the same time, it's, again, we have to emphasize the survival part of it. And you mentioned joy at some point, right? I don't get into much joy because unfortunately in the book, a lot of the works that I looked at had very little of that, to be honest. But I do know that, in terms of undocumented communities, in Puerto Rico, joy is so important. The music, the food, the way the community interacts and supports one another, right? So you see those in daily life. You see that coming through in daily life. That doesn't take away the fact that, they're constantly trying to survive. Again, I'm focusing on the case of Puerto Rico and people, Dominicans or Haitians being there, trying to survive. That is something that it's always in the back of one's mind. So, but it is going against the system. It is going against U.S. empire, right? And even Puerto Rico's case as a territory that should be helping the U.S. in surveilling the region, right? I mean, they use Puerto Rico as a very important, strategic region, but at the same time, so many of these people are also welcome into Puerto Rico, and they continue to live there. So I talk about Puerto Rico as interestingly, as a disruptor of U.S. empire, because it's kind of messing up the U.S.'s plans to have complete control of this region by constantly attracting people. And I don't know, it's just it's an interesting phenomenon, I think.
I mean, I think that's why the kind of link of marronage in your work is so clear, because part of it is this kind of method of escape that is very complex.
Right.
There's no singular formulation of it, and that there's a lot of pitfalls and danger and violence as part of that process. And yet there is this other island, right? This other archipelago, Puerto Rico, that is both the receiver of sometimes an antagonist and sometimes a much more kind of kin relation to it, right? I'm thinking about that video from Tego Calderon a few years ago, right? Where the entire thing was about seeing a Dominican family arriving on the shores and like going out to welcome them, right? To offer them some type of like home and safety. And there's so many different ways that this pops up, right?
Yeah.
In the cultural productions of Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily seen in the kind of political discourse. It's
Mhm.
not seen in the newspapers, right? Like it's not seen in like we get a lot of antagonistic coverage, right?
Yeah.
But I think the attention to the cultural production is also one that attends to the relationality, as well as the kind of like empathy and the kind of connections across that do exist. And I think it's important to like highlight those and to even help to build them out, right?
Yeah.
We do have a question in the chat. So I wanted to, you got saved for my last question, which was going to be, what are you working on now? But the question that's in the chat is from Patria Sanchez, who asks, what is the message that you want people to take away from reading your book? Or perhaps there are multiple messages that can be kind of attained by the individuals reading it. I want to say that the chapters of the book are equally discrete as they are kind of can be read together, which I think is really powerful in the book if you're going to go one by one or read across them. But yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for that question from the audience. It's hard because I feel like I have several messages that I would like to send with this book, but everyone's, once it's out there, people do with it what they want. But I would say that to me, one of the main ones has to do with trying to help people understand the reasons behind undocumented migration, first of all, because undocumented immigrants have been and continue to be demonized worldwide. So it's not just obviously particular to Puerto Rico or to the United States, although it's, and with election season coming up, we're already seeing the way that rhetoric is being used again for political purposes. So to me, it's about creating empathy and I think if people understood the reasons why people are engaging in this type of very dangerous journey to try to survive somewhere else in the Caribbean, I think it would do a lot for our society in terms of helping many of us who may, say, I don't want anything with those people or whatever, all these things that people tend to think, the stereotypes, right? It would, in a ideal world, lead to more solidarity and understanding, right? So that would be one of the main things. But also to center Blackness in terms of Caribbean Latinx studies, archipelago studies, and all of that. So.
And then we just have a few more minutes, but I do have one last question, and it'll be the last one, which is from a graduate student who says, thank you for this wonderful talk. I was wondering if you could expand on the approach you suggest for literary students who are interested in engaging visual art as part of our graduate project. So you opened the door by saying, I'm not a visual studies person, but I did it. So how did you do it? What advice would you give to grad students who want to do this, but might be literary studies scholars?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that if you are really moved by art, but your training is in literature, don't let that dissuade you from engaging with it. I found that, I try to approach the art as a text, right? And trying to look at the symbolisms and everything that this piece of art was telling me. So it's not that different from what we do in terms of analyzing a poem or a story or a novel, etc. There are a lot of connections. So kind of hold on to that, right? And the other thing that helped me was then reading a lot of, or quite a bit of scholarship by art critics, right? And then kind of learning, even integrating it into my own analysis, right? Citing people who had written about particular works that I was looking at too, etc. So just kind of maybe, yeah, just becoming familiarized with how the scholarship in the art criticism works can also be should be very important as part of that journey. But that's what I would say. But don't let it dissuade you, because we are capable of doing more than what we're trained to do, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Pues mira, con eso vamos a cerrar.
Thank you.
So much for joining us and for sharing this a little bit more about the creation and the impetus of this beautiful book, Crossing Waters. I'm just so honored that you would take some time out, especially in the kind of climate that we're living in today, right? And all of our hearts and minds are with these international solidarities of struggle.
Yeah.
And you would take some time to share with us this book. We really appreciate it, and we can't wait to welcome you back to Centro. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. Nos vemos.